So to finish up today's lecture, we're going to go over the process of photosynthesis. So starting with an overview of the cell, in a typical plant cell, we have our nucleus, and then we have these structures known as chloroplasts. And what a chloroplast is, it's stacks of thylakoid discs inside of this outer membrane. So you have the inner membrane, the outer membrane, and then inside of the chloroplast of a eukaryotic cell, so not only plants, we're talking about algae as well, this is what we're dealing with. Now with a bacterial cell, again, prokaryotic cell, there's no internal organelles, there's just a clump of DNA somewhere in here, in a region known as the nucleoid. With both of these, we're going to initiate the process of photosynthesis with sunlight. So if we have the sun, and then we have little rays of light coming down, the sun is happy. Sunlight is going to hit the surface of these thylakoid discs, or sunlight is going to hit the surface of the cell wall of a prokaryotic cell. The light-dependent reactions. So on the surface of the thylakoid membrane, it's actually similar to an electron transport chain. So we have this surface here. We've got our sunlight up here in the corner, and the rays of light are shining down on the membrane. And we have these different regions. The first region that sunlight is going to hit is called Photosystem 2. These photosystems were labeled and named in the order that they were discovered, not in the order that they actually go through the cycle. So photosystem 2 comes first. When sunlight hits photosystem 2, an electron is excited and it bounces off of the membrane. That electron is captured by a transporter, and that transporter is known as plastoquinone, which delivers the electron to the next step along the way, cytochrome. Inside of cytochrome, it interacts and it loses energy, but then it will get excited and it bounces up again. And this time when it bounces up, it gets captured by a different transporter known as plastocyanin. And plastocyanin is going to deliver the electron to the next step along the way, photosystem 1. From here, we actually need another ray of sunlight to activate this thing. So we have another photon of light that hits this photosystem 1, and the electron can be excited again. But this time, when the electron is excited, it's carried away by ferredoxin reductase, or ferredoxin, to ferredoxin reductase. And ferredoxin reductase is going to use those electrons and combine them with some hydrogens in order to produce NADPH. There's a couple other components we have to talk about. First of all, you can't just snatch an electron away from a photosystem. That leaves a very unstable and unsettling situation at the photosystem. This electron has to be replaced. So what we do is we actually split water. So H2O gets split into the hydrogen ions, the electrons, and oxygen. Oxygen gas is released as a waste product. But the hydrogen ions start to accumulate here. And the electron goes up here to replace the electron that left in photosystem 2. We can't have accumulating hydrogens. We just learned about what happens when hydrogens accumulate. An acid is produced. So we have to get rid of them. Well, we're going to get rid of them in the exact same way, using the exact same transporter as we did in the electron transport chain. ATP synthase. And these hydrogens now are going to flow through ATPase. And these are the hydrogens that are going to be supplied to NADP to make NADPH. Rotation of this complex here leads to the generation of ATP. So now you have ATP produced and NADPH. Those are the two major products of the light-dependent reactions. This summarizes that. So here's photosystem 2, and you have light hitting photosystem 2, which excites an electron, and that's carried by plastoquinone to cytochrome, and that's carried by plastocyanin to photosystem 1. Another photon of light hits this. Ferredoxin carries this to ferredoxin reductase, which causes the conversion of NADP to NADPH by adding this hydrogen. Here you can see water is split to create oxygen and hydrogen. The electrons are going to replace the electron that was excited from the photosystem 2. The hydrogens accumulate in here, and they're going to go through this ATP synthase, which is a big complex that's going to be rotating. And once it rotates, it takes ADP, combines with another phosphate to create ATP. So your two final end products of photosynthesis are NADPH and ATP. So now in the light-dependent reactions, we don't really need this slide because it's all kind of covered right here. With the light-dependent reactions, you have ATP and NADPH coming from the light-dependent reactions, and they enter into the Calvin cycle. So the Calvin cycle is depicted here. You get carbon dioxide from the environment, rubisco, which you can get from the soil and from the environment. Water is added, which again comes from the environment. So NADPH, ATP, CO2, rubisco, and H2O come into the Calvin cycle to produce G3P. G3P, glucose 3-phosphate, is a precursor to just straight up glucose. So eventually that gets converted to glucose. This part of the system does not require light. So the light-dependent reactions happened in the thylakoid discs of the chloroplast if we're talking about eukaryotic cells, or just in the cell wall if we're talking about the prokaryotic cell. That produced two components that are necessary for the light-dependent independent reactions. And the light-independent reactions are just going to happen in the cytosol if we're talking about a prokaryotic cell, or inside of the matrix of the chloroplast if we're talking about a eukaryotic cell. The end product of photosynthesis is glucose or a sugar. We can also take this G3P and turn it into other things, but glucose is what we're really after for energy production. Once we used the sunlight to make our food, now we can use the glucose and break it apart and send it through aerobic respiration to make energy. Although this process takes energy from the sun and uses up some energy, breaking glucose down releases more energy than this costs. So in the end, after we do photosynthesis and cellular respiration, we end up with a net gain of energy.